This is a seminar that brings together fellows of the Tata program and many others across MIT who are interested in learning the methodologies and perspectives that are useful in thinking about challenges of emerging communities. So today's session, as you know, we have a special guest, Mr. Ratan Tata, and accompanying him is Venkat. Both of them are here from Mumbai, so please give them a very warm welcome. Mr. Tata, of course, needs no introduction in most crowds, particularly this one. So I'm going to instead say thank you for creating this incredible opportunity for many of us in this room to follow our passions and hopefully make a difference. The plan for today's session, as you know, is a Q&A with students. All of the questions that you hear are submitted by students, and they represent challenges that they are actively wrestling with. So for many of us, this is a working session.
You're way down there.
I'm shorter. So the question that I would like us to start with is a question of, is a flavor of where to focus. So this is about where should such solutions of technology and systems focus in terms of the economic pyramid. So should we focus on, say, the growing middle class, or should it be focused on the absolute bottom of the pyramid, or should we think about all of the above? And the question really is, how do you, in your work, think about such questions?
Yeah, I don't think there's a ready answer to this. I was asked this question earlier today. If you take the whole pyramid and you therefore are serving also the bottom of the pyramid, you have a market size of in India, of about 600 million people in terms of the people that are moving into that pyramid from the bottom. And the base of the pyramid itself is around another, 250 that's coming into that 600, or making up that 600. So it's something that cannot be ignored, but catering to it means looking at products that are affordable to that group, are not in fact inferior products, but products that are designed to embrace the group. You cannot ignore the other 250 also. So the fact is that you usually have to span, you can't be the low-end player only. You have to be in the other area, perhaps gaining some of the halo from that into the other products. But the low-end products should not be devised as inferior products perceived to be inferior to the rest of the market.
That's great. I think this is one of the themes that we have embraced very early, and probably taken the discussion, probably conceptualized the pyramid as a global thing, because from the very beginning, we have been thinking about reverse innovation, where the concept of pyramid becomes one hemisphere versus another hemisphere. So another form of sort of a flavor of where to focus comes in the sense of should we focus on customer needs versus desires? There was a specific question from somebody who works on providing electric power. Ryan spectacular. So would you like to ask a question? Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much. My name is Brian Spataka. I'm a material scientist. I work on electrification, electricity access. We were just in India a couple months ago, and one of the things that really struck us was something that was captured in a New York Times op-ed article a couple of weeks ago. It was titled, "Let the Poor Have Fun," and it focused a lot on the interesting phenomena where in some of the developing places in the world, specifically India, technology is leveraged not always to provide improvements in quality of life or the bare necessities as we would think of them, but rather to provide for things like entertainment and pleasure. And so my question to you is that for those of us working on things like electricity access, should we be at all concerned about how our technology, how electricity is going to be used? Should we focus on providing electricity infrastructure that only serves the most basic needs, or is that too paternalistic?
My view on that is that sometimes desire becomes necessity in course of time of usage. You mentioned entertainment. A few years ago, all of us were content to having a black and white TV set. That was our entertainment, certainly in India. And having a color TV set was a luxury. And that was aspirational that you look to that as an ownership that you might have someday in the future. Today, how many people would accept a black and white TV set as a form of entertainment, or even a black and white display on a cell phone? Our needs have changed, and they have what was aspirational in 1 year is now considered to be something of a need. The content of it, entertainment, also today becomes something you can't do without, and it's how you market the product and and the role it plays in the marketplace. So I think technology is driving something that may commence in the marketplace as being an aspirational issue. Eventually, I think all of us want to have everything there is. The world over, I think we use about 10 or 20% of the capability of our cell phones or smartphones, but we have to have them. People have to have all-wheel drive cars, or they never go off the main roads, but they have to have them. And I think that's the part of technology, and the price comes down, and they become affordable and become things they need to have.
So that sort of reminds me of what happened to me last year when my mother left from here to go back to India, and when I called her back to ask how she's doing, she said, "Well, I'm doing fine, but I'm missing the iPad." So I had not imagined that would be her answer. Now, so the whole question of sort of desire and motivation also comes up at a level of the entire culture in some ways. Rachel Perlman here, she works on the problems of waste management, and you had a question about dealing with cultural.
Hi, I'm Rachel Perlman. So relating to kind of India's culture, we've noticed, and it's pretty understood, that most Indians aren't motivated to separate or sort their waste. I study waste management from a sustainability and economical standpoint. So they don't separate their trash into recyclables or biodegradable waste and things like that. And do you think this is going to be how it is forever, or is there?
Sorry.
Do you think it's going to always be like this, or there's a way to actually change this? Make Indians, is there a way that Indians will become motivated culturally to separate their waste?
I'm sorry, didn't you make India?
Do you think Indians will become motivated by something? Is there something that will motivate Indians to separate their waste?
the waste separation. So working on separating waste from recyclables and so on.
Oh, I
Feels
see.
like-
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. I think there, with apologizing to all my countrymen in the room, we have been a nation of careless people in the sense we throw trash on the road. I lived in an apartment house where on the second floor I got everybody's trash that just got dumped. The people on top had a better time than the people who lived on low floors. We need to be more caring about what we do and more proud of more responsible for what we do. With that will come issues of having a sense of responsibility to first handle trash that doesn't just get thrown out as though the road is the receptacle for all trash, to then separating out trash and then recycling waste in one form or another so that we conserve this. I think it's an issue of standards. Our politicians should demand it, and we as citizens should embrace that. We do now start to see garbage collection. We do now start to see garbage bags and garbage cans appearing in the cities, but it needs to be enforced and it needs to be promoted by the civic authorities much more than they have. But the answer to your question is, yes, I think India will, in fact, the Indians will be sensitive to this, and we have a campaign to make that so.
So in some sense, all of these, in my mind, are questions of how does one learn to listen to their consumers and understand them. There were a number of questions that came from fellows in this room that I'm summarizing here as to if one were to think about successes of Tata Group versus projects that did not do what they were intended to do. Specific examples people mentioned were Swatch and Nano, the challenges that were there. What were the key features of these successes and failures, and particularly about how to listen to the consumer?
The lessons, to quickly go to Nano, which I know more about than the Swatch, for example, the Nano didn't do as well as we expected, partly due to circumstance and partly due to our own mistakes. The circumstances related to having to shift a factory to a new location and losing a year going from West Bengal to Gujarat, and therefore having the product losing its excitement from the time it was launched, which is not intended. But what we did wrong was that we marketed it after that year's delay as though there was nothing different from what there was when we launched it, that we made no effort to sell that product differently than any other car. And by that time, we just were out of sync with what the market wanted. That I could go on, but broadly that is so. So we have, by and large, been a nation where for 50 years we have been in a seller's market. And even if we at the top feel that we're now in a buyer's market, people down the line have to feel the same way. for all intents and purposes, I think the lessons one learns is that the Indian consumer is not the same consumer as he was 30 years ago. He has had the benefit of choice, which he did not have for many years. We for example, had through independence, we had 2 cars that were available in India. You waited 7 to 10 years for that car after you ordered it. Those 2 companies collectively produced 50,000 cars a year and no more. And that was what happened until the government, in joint venture with Suzuki, put up a new car factory, and suddenly everyone was there. So today the consumer, you give him the kind of car that was there 50 years ago or 30 years ago, and he's not going to buy it. And people that make the mistake that they can give the customer or market a product in the way they did earlier are going to have a problem. And I'd have to say with humility that in the Nano we suffered a little bit from that. I think also that the Indian market is, the Indian buyer is a traditional buyer. He's very price sensitive, but he doesn't want to be seen to be getting something that's stripped of the bells and whistles that he feels proud of or aspires to have. And you need to cater to that. He's a very sensitive buyer in terms of price, but he's also very demanding. So whatever goods or services we offer, we have to be conscious that this is an aspiring buyer, but he's also a demanding buyer. And we have to excite him. It may be at different levels, but...
The next 2 questions in this section, they bring us back to more sort of at a personal level. They bring us back home in the way of asking about the person engaged in this kind of work. Barry, here, you had a question about sort of how does one think about whether this is an opportunity or is it a responsibility? Could you ask that question?
So I guess, I'm Barry. I was in the housing group we had yesterday. I guess my question for this particular is, from the business ventures that you've been taking on from the Nano or the Swash, and sort of, do you see...
I can't hear you very well up here.
The ventures with Tata Nano or the Swash or even the interest in housing, and do you see these businesses as an opportunity or a responsibility? And if so, do you think that every private corporation in an ideal world should be pursuing this?
I think in India, you're asking whether we should look at the low end of the market as a responsibility or an opportunity. I think it's both. I think we have to understand that it should be the desire and a sense of satisfaction, a goal of satisfaction for every manufacturer to reach that customer in a manner that I tried to describe, that you meet his aspirations and you meet his affordability levels. And being able to do both those gives you a runaway success product in that marketplace, which is an opportunity. But it's also a responsibility that we don't just keep aspiring to serve the top of the pyramid and ignore the rest of the country and confine them or in fact push them towards living with hand-downs and second-hand products and and inferior compromises, whether that be in architecture, whether it be in consumer products, or the way we treat those customers. So I think it's a bit of both an opportunity and a responsibility. And in a country like India or the developing world, you can't ignore that sense of responsibility that you should have. And technology is a tremendous motivator to break those barriers.
So one related question,
Yeah.
since we brought up responsibility, how do you feel about whether corporations in India, how much do they share your view? I ask this question in light of the Corporate Social Responsibility Act being created.
To be very frank, very few corporations would share that view. And the government of India has done something that on the surface looks very, very worthwhile, but I think motivationally it's the wrong thing. The government has mandated that every corporation should spend 2%, will need to spend 2% of its net profit for CSR activities. This is going to be like a tax. All of us today who would pursue this by desire or wish are looking for and being concerned about what we can do, the sense of responsibility. By making it a tax, the responsibility factor goes away. It's a cost. And I fear what's going to happen is you're going to get a tsunami of NGOs that'll emerge just to receive this money, which is going to have to find a home. And there will be a series of fake causes that will be mooted that fulfill the government's requirement. The corporations couldn't care less, which is a terrible shame because they couldn't care. All their responsibility stops with handing the money over to a cause. And the opportunity, in fact, then that money may never reach the people that are supposed to be the beneficiaries of it. So I think what's happening is wrong. You asked that question a year from now, and the answer would be all corporations are participating in CSR, but they're not. They're paying a tax.
Let me continue with the individual level questions.
Okay.
There are two of them that are very thoughtful and somewhat hard questions. And they're both about where to stop when you're doing this kind of work. So Kevin had a particularly interesting question about sort of stepping on cultures and so on. You could ask that.
My name is Kevin Simon. My question is, we do international development work here, and that often requires social change and social architecting. But I'm curious, at what point do we, enacting this social change, begin to step on parts of culture and societies that are actually worth preserving? And how do we avoid doing unnecessary damage in this way?
I don't know that there's a single answer for that because, one has seen very successful products transfer the usage or the appeal of the product exactly as it is in the developed world, and it's accepted. And there are other products that have to be tweaked or modified to meet the cultural or usage practices in India. I think a company has to be sensitive to this, and sometimes in a subtle way, and sometimes in very overt manner. Coca-Cola may change the taste of Coca-Cola in India compared to what it is here. A Chinese restaurant may have a different tasting Chinese food in India than it might in China. And those kinds of subtle or overt changes that take place, I think are reflections of corporations that modify this as they go. But sensitivity, I think, is exceedingly important, and willingness to be able to modify something when they see the customers are dissatisfied. So we're coming back to what you said, how do you listen to do you listen to your customers? I think in this case it's essential that you do.
So, not to continue on this trend, but my curiosity comes back to questions like waste management.
Pardon?
My question comes back to issues like waste management, where there's this problem where lots of people are just throwing trash on the ground in India, as an example. And you said that the problem is a consequence of low standards that Indians have for cleanliness.
What I meant was low standards that the government sets, which is tied in. One of the greatest ills that we have today that keep India from being where it could be is the fact that enforcement of various factors in India are very poor. So I'll give you a graphic example of the government introduced seat belts in cars to be used in India so many years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. But they enforced it in a very dramatic manner. They fined you 1,000 rupees if you didn't have a seatbelt on. And in 2 months, you'd almost never see anybody without a seatbelt on. Other laws just don't get enforced, and they just go on, and trash falls into, waste management falls into that kind of category. So hygiene-related and cleanliness-related laws are very seldom enforced because the standards that our governments, local governments set for those kinds of standards are very low.
Great. I think we're ready to move on to the next section, which has to do with government versus private sector. Let me get us started by asking a very broad question as to how do you see the role of government versus for-profit versus not-for-profit?
There are very few businesses which are not-for-profit in India. As far as private sector to public sector, I think both have coexisted since 91. The private sector plays a much bigger role because restrictions against their growth, etc., have been removed. We in Tata spend about 4% of our net profit between companies and our foundation towards charitable and philanthropic pursuits. oddly enough, when India opened up to foreign investment and we started to have foreign investors, for the first time we faced an outcry from foreign investors that you're giving away our money in philanthropic causes, and that's our money and should not, in fact, be distributed to CSR or towards goals other than returning it to us as dividends. The view we had and continue to have is that we have created an enormous amount of goodwill and prosperity around the areas where we operate by not being a not-for-profit company, but being a responsible company to the needs of the population and providing rural education, medical assistance, etc., which the government does not provide. And so I think if more companies did that, more corporations did that, they would be well received. And my view is they can all coexist together. The public sector is mandated to do this, but often does not.
So I have to say that's a very refreshing view that you don't often hear from most people in the private sector. There was one question that Carolyn, you had about, are there areas that Tata has decided not to enter? Could you ask?
Yes, I'm Caroline Howe. I'm working in the Waste Management Group. And the question I had was around whether you've explored some of the sectors that we're currently looking for opportunities in and chosen for Tata as a business to not move in that direction. So how you made those choices and what led you from the strategic perspective choose not to dig into these sectors so far.
I wish I could answer that by saying that we had a template that, or gates that we went through that, and that we had to pass all those thresholds to arrive at a decision. But often it's been just intuitive. That's my honest answer to you. It's been some degree of analysis of what that business might look like. Sometimes it's a business that hasn't been done in India, and so it's a view of what that business looks like in another country, how successful it would be. And sometimes it succeeds when you bring it to India, and sometimes it doesn't. So the true answer and the honest answer to you would be to say that it's to a great extent hunch or intuitiveness that drives you, most often not with negative data. You support the data, but you could still say no. And sometimes it takes much more effort to be successful or profitable in that business than you had hoped. But by and large, we're still a country with tremendous unfulfilled demand, and for that reason, it's not as tight as it might be here.
I was telling you earlier that when we were talking about the role of intuition, the importance of intuition, that many of us may not have come to trust, that you seem to really emphasize as being something that is really useful in making important decisions.
I really believe that success, or at least a fun organization to be in and work in, is where the leadership in that organization enjoys the business they're in and are passionately involved in that business. Having said that, if you look again, and using the car industry as an example, as I mentioned to you, a successful car company, or a car company that's successful because they go through cycles based on their leadership. You had a case of Mr. Iacocca, who conceived of the Mustang, and it was greatly successful. You had people like DeLorean, who ran their businesses with great passion, exceedingly successful. And you had a lot of people in companies like General Motors and Ford and Chrysler, who at various times went through motions of having car clinics and great studies made about demand and what they should look like with the best consultants in the country, and those products failed. So I think a successful company has to have somebody in that company who's the ideal consumer, who knows the consumer market. And I mentioned to you, it's almost like being a music agent. There are people who have it in them to listen to a rock group and say, this group is really going to succeed, and sign them up, and they're a great success. And I think it's the same in a company. You conceive of a product and it's a great success. And Nano, when announced, was a great success. We made some mistakes. But the market reacted very positively to it.
Let me bring us back to our subject. I'm sorry. I got attracted to talking about importance of intuition. There was a question, again, related to the role of corporation. It came from Murthy. You had a question about the culture and peeling away the negative aspects of culture.
I'm Murthy. I'm working in Professor Amos Winter's lab on developing a prosthetic knee for Jaipur foot. My question to you is, growing up in India, the Tatas have...
Sorry?
Growing up in India,
Yeah.
the Tatas have always been an inspiration, not because of their CSI initiatives or not because of their stature, but because what they've stood for. I have one small anecdote in mind. Back in 1974, a lot of people must have talked to you about this, when Sudha Murthy wrote a letter to J.R.D. Tata expressing her discontent over not being employed on Telco's shop floors because they wouldn't hire women. And Tata was one of the first companies that took a stand that we are going to hire women on our shop floors. So that was one of very powerful anecdotes while growing up that I heard about the Tatas. So what do you think the role of industrial giants such as Tata in India can be to totally change these aspects of culture? There are different negative, to finish my question, things like caste discrimination, women's safety, female infanticide, which may not directly be related to what you do every day, but you can make a huge difference to these issues.
My own personal feeling is that companies should have the responsibility to remove those inequities, both in gender, religious groups, etc. We have endeavored, not always successfully, but we have always endeavored to be open. We may have had an incident like Sudha Murthy, who brought that to our attention, and J.R.D. Tata responded. But in many other ways, we have tried our best to remove those inequities or not have constraints or restrictions in the manner in which we've operated. We've had women directors executive directors in companies for several years. We have never sought to determine the religious backgrounds of people or or sought to find out which caste they come from, etc. Because I, for one, feel that India will really have arrived if we become a land of equal opportunity, that doesn't make any difference whether you're male or female, what religion you come from, or what your background is. We're still suffering from the feudal legacies that we've had for centuries. I don't know whether that answers it.
Yeah, it wasn't as much of a question.
The best answer we can give you is more anecdotes of cases where we've rectified problems that exist.
Great. So let me take us to the next set of questions, which have to do with dealing with market and regulatory uncertainties. Let's open up with a question that Vivek had about the lessons. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Vivek. I grew up in Pune, and one of the first cars my dad had was a Tata Trusts, and many of my happiest Trusts.
No, we don't make the tracks
Anymore.
I never did. The track, I need to correct that. The tracks, I think, was Bajaj.
It was? Oh, I'm so sorry. My question
Anyway, whatever it was.
My question is about infrastructure delivery.
Yeah.
So I work on studying infrastructure projects like airports and power plants. And often the conversation is about institutions and stakeholder landscapes, and it turns into a game of power and influence. And so my question to you is, as a business leader, how do you influence the stakeholder and institutional landscape in bringing some ideas to fruition more generally?
Do we have a stakeholder institution?
So, for example, the Indian Planning Commission has policies on public-private partnerships for infrastructure. So I'm wondering, as a business leader that's providing services or technologies for a complex issue like infrastructure, how do you navigate the institutional landscape in dealing with government and regulators?
I don't know how to answer that because speaking for ourselves, we have followed whatever the legal requirements are. Many a times because we don't participate in the undercurrent of the subjective side of getting things done, it has either taken us longer or we have been disadvantaged by being rejected in an area. The sad part about the Indian scene is that the people who supposedly act as your stakeholders or in your interest or in the country's interest are usually those who are serving the vested interest groups in the country, who more often than not are in the private sector and who often are keen to protect themselves against competition rather than let that decision be taken in the marketplace.
And so another related sort of question about public policy was, how does one think about it? It came from Doug Ellman. Would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, hi, my name's Doug. I'm part of the electrification group here. And a lot of the early part of this semester and our trip to India this summer has been about learning the context in India, and especially as that relates to our particular projects. So, for example, for electricity, what policies and regulations relate to electricity, and then what political situation maybe has led to those policies and regulations. And now the question is, how do you decide when to accept those policies and regulations and political situation as given and design a solution within those versus look to design a solution that maybe could do a lot more good if policies were different and hope or work towards changing those policies?
Well, whenever a policy is what we would consider to be market unfriendly or bias in one form or another, we will, speaking for Tatas, we will go and endeavor to get our views seen by the government. If those policy issues are created again for vested interest protection, the chances are we will not succeed. We will not manipulate those policies or get them changed by any means. And so to that extent, we have a disadvantage. Let me give you a picture. You talked about electricity. Let's say a contract is being given in India which has a foreign participation in it. There is a likelihood that the terms of that contract are such that the foreign investor will withdraw because the conditions are those that he cannot meet. Then you may find an Indian contractor bidding at a price or agreeing to those terms because he knows that he's going to change the policy along the way after he gets the contract. And that degree of subjectivity is there today, and the earlier we really stand by and kill it is the time we're going to have a better situation in terms of being able to live by policies, good or bad as they may be. It applies to everybody.
Another question about uncertainty in the policy realm was about inefficient implementation. It came from Sagar. Do I see Sagar here? Who works on biodiesel and worries about it in the energy sector.
Okay.
Hello, Mr. Tata.
Hi.
My name is Sagar. I work on the waste to energy sector, in the waste to energy sector, and specifically biodiesel. So, my question, actually, to give some background to everyone about the state of implementation of policies in India. So, the government passed the National Biofuels Policy in 2008, which aimed at having 20% of biodiesel in regular diesel by 2012. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and it has been postponed till 2017. So, government is a very important stakeholder in our projects, given that energy is in focus. So, my question to you is, how much of support can we expect from the government in terms of tax benefits, subsidies? Because that is very important as a motivation for starting off our project. So, what would your opinion be?
For example, in the biodiesel area, I don't know enough about it to comment on how or why the criteria got postponed. But often the government develops a policy, and the reasons for it not being met is somewhere else. There is another contradictory policy that's been established that makes it impossible. Similar to what you're talking about is the acceptance of emission standards for automobiles, for emission and pollution issues. Many of those requirements today to meet Euro 4 or Euro 5 standards involves low sulfur fuel. Diesel fuel, for example. There's hardly any produced in the country because of some other policy that has not enabled that to happen. And if that doesn't happen, you can't have the emission standards that you wish to have. So I can't answer that. Theoretically, if the government is keen to enforce something, it comes back to what I said earlier. The enforcement is bad. the enforcement worked, other things would fall in place because your goal of having that criteria in place would be forced to be there.
I'm sorry, just to add on to it. So can we expect any kind of tax benefits, subsidies? I mean, will the government be really interested if we go to the government and say, we really want to do this in India, we have a passion for it, it will do social benefits? Can we be reasonable in expecting that? Because that helps us in building our business plan. Because you're taking those subsidies.
I think you would need to make a case for that. You may have a good case because biodiesel would probably be a locally manufactured biodiesel, and would replace some of the imports of petroleum products into the country, which the country is reeling from today in terms of an export obligation, and so theoretically you should have a basis where the government should support you. Industry would have nothing to fight you on because it would be a very logical thing to do. How it's implemented is another matter.
Thank you so much.
Another question from Alison Greenlee here, whose work depends on something that's a moving target. So again, a form of uncertainty. Let me have Alison. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alison Greenlee, and I work in the photovoltaic manufacturing lab. And so my question is, all of our technologies today, I think we're very concerned with hitting a moving target of performance. So back to what you were saying before about having a black and white television. If we were to come up with a technology that might solve an existing problem today, it's a concern, or it's a question if it will be relevant in the next 20 years. And so my question is, given that all of our projects are somewhat related to infrastructure, whether it be energy or transportation, how do you foresee this changing in India over the next couple of decades? And how do you think about this when planning your own projects?
I think most of us who would speak honestly would tell you that the greatest need in India today is moving forward with infrastructure, road infrastructure, connectivity, ports, airports. These are all drivers of future growth and GDP growth in the country. There are various, again, we're looking at contradictory laws. There are various new policies of government against land acquisition, against right-of-way, etc., which have been, in my view, brought into effect because of forthcoming elections, which are going to bring a lot of the large infrastructure projects to a halt, if not to a halt, certainly will delay them, which is a great negative for India. It's a very important thing that energy, connectivity, etc., be accelerated in India. And unless these bans are removed, we will not see them. And we had a momentum which, in my view, has been lost. I can only say that I'm hopeful that the government will realize this and bring back the necessary amendments to policy to enable these to take place.
So the final question of this section, so in this section we've been doing a lot of deep dive because these are problems very relevant to individual projects that people in the center are currently working on. But the final question goes to David Taylor, who could bring us back up by asking a question about the corruptibility or how to stay uncorrupt in this difficult environment of uncertainty.
Sure. My name is David Taylor. And my question is, the Tata Group has a large reputation around being uncorrupt, and I think that when you walk into a meeting and people know that about you, is easier to maintain that reputation. And I wondered if you could comment what the road ahead of companies that don't yet have that reputation looks like, and what the process of establishing a reputation like that requires.
You're talking about a company that doesn't have that reputation as yet, meaning a company that, like us, does not wish to cross that line.
Yes, the company that perhaps in the past has crossed the line and now would like to stop crossing the line.
That's a difficult one, because in my view, once you have done that, you can't be in a room where you're not asked, because you've been there. You can do that with the change of leadership or change of ownership or something of this nature, but if you forget that caveat, I think the only thing I can say is that if one takes that stance, which I hope more companies would, then you have to be prepared to face some rejections and some disadvantage and just pursue that. Eventually, I believe that you can acquire that position if you take a somewhat longer-term view on what you want to do, rather than have a pressure of doing something in a very short period of time. India needs to have companies that decide that they're going to stand together and not do this. And today, all the attention on corruption is to the taker. That is, the government is taker. But there's a giver. And that giver is the private sector for most part. And if that changed, it would take care of so many of the subjective things that take place in the country today.
That quick follow-up, is the presence of multinationals making the givers market bigger or smaller? How does that change?
It's been a mixed bag, because you Corrupt Practices Act that supposedly ban multinational, certainly American companies from doing that. Many American companies that are highly reputable work through advisors, consultants, etc., and it seems to me that it doesn't change if you change the color of your hair.
Right.
It's still the same thing. So, and there are other companies that don't. So, I can't answer that as a yes or no, but I think multinationals could play a big role in not doing that. And in fact, indicating their willingness to leave India but not to do this, which doesn't happen that frequently. It does from time to time.
Thank you.
So that's a great segue to our last section, which is about past experiences and future directions. So let's first start with the future directions. These are mostly India-related questions. The first one comes from Kevin Kung about how the climate of business is changing.
So my name is Kevin, and I work in waste management. And for a lot of us who are engaged with engineering and technology, it is important to consider how that is linked to how business is being done in India. And to that end, I'm interested in hearing from your view, since you've been involved with Tata for the past few decades. What are some of the most important trends in doing business, in particular as they pertain to technologically driven or product-driven business?
I understood the question.
So what are the most significant ways in which business has changed for the Tata Group in the last 20 years?
Well, perhaps the best way I can answer that is from the period of time when it was a controlled economy to now, there's been a much stronger profit motivation, not huge profits at all costs, but a focus on profits, which we didn't have. We didn't have to worry about profits at one time. We never defined them. We never had goals. When I joined the group in '62, we never had a profit meeting. Our budgets were production budgets because everything we made got sold. So profit has been a factor. Inorganic growth, which we never did. We never grew by acquisition. It was always internal growth. In the past few years, we have looked at inorganic growth as an acceptable means of growing. We've also looked at mergers and divestments as issues that we never did before, but that we do today. And we looked at growing outside India, overseas, again through either acquisition or organic growth outside India. And those, I think, have been the change. Along with that, we have focused on trying to upgrade technology to listen to the customer to a greater extent, and to try and excel in what we were doing. Earlier, whether we excelled or didn't excel, whether we were optimal or not optimal, whether we had scale or not, honestly didn't matter. We could have one small company producing lipsticks which had no connection with another business that we had, and we could survive, but maybe we were fifth or sixth in the market. In 91, we set a goal that we should be the first, second, or third in the marketplace, so we should look at divesting that company or that business or putting it under another Tata company. So those are the kinds of changes that took place within our group.
So another form of change that someone has a question about is this, the climate of risk-taking as it's changing in India, particularly entrepreneurship. It comes from Raj Nair, who works on entrepreneurship.
So I'm Raj Nair. My question, you're an entrepreneur and a visionary, and the question is, what do you see the role of an entrepreneur is in nation building? And second is, if you could actually develop or train entrepreneurs like any other profession, like doctors or engineers, how do you see it changing the society?
First of all, I'd say that I consider entrepreneurship and the presence of entrepreneurs is an exceedingly important part in any nation's overall infrastructure, industrial infrastructure. I think without an entrepreneur who is capable and nimble-footed in the sense of adopting technology, adopting change, catering to the customer, you'd be stuck with large corporations who have legacy costs, who are unwilling to change. So the small entrepreneur or medium-sized entrepreneur is a very important part of an infrastructure. It needs to be encouraged. As far as training an entrepreneur is concerned, I think enlightened larger corporations have always looked at entrepreneurs as somebody they should support because it plays that important role that I tried to mention. We don't have, on the industrial front, any formal method of training entrepreneurs other than supporting them in the marketplace by taking their products or working with them. But truly working with them and overcoming a not invented here syndrome in companies is the mark of an enlightened company which eventually gains more from that entrepreneurship around them than they do to shun them as more traditional companies do. So keeping in line with large firms and entrepreneurship, there was a question from Nadia about sort of
indigenous innovation or endeavor versus large companies?
I have a question about the friction that exists between harnessing economies of scale to be able to roll out large technical changes quickly. So if you take the Tata swatch, you're able to implement something relatively cheaply and then use an economy of scale to manufacture it cheaply and then distribute it widely. However, if you have very localized problems or you're trying to solve a problem very locally with local resources, then you're not necessarily going to be able to have access to those same kind of possibilities that are afforded with these economies. And especially within a graduate program environment, a lot of what we're working on is kind of smaller scale problems like that aren't necessarily thinking in this broad rollout scheme. And so how would you discuss the benefits and drawbacks of those two different approaches, and how could we fold that into our work better?
This is a question about localized grassroots solutions using versus economies of scale of the large organizations.
You know, I think economies of scale, if they become issues that relate to imports or to justify imported technology or to justify foreign companies marketing in India, I think those criteria for the wrong reason. I think the issue really is what is best for the consumer. If it is a low cost that can come from economies of scale, whether they come from India or outside, then that should be the pursuit. If, on the other hand, a homegrown solution meets the needs of the marketplace,
That often will really depend on how you decide to tackle the problem. Like
Sorry?
if you take, it will depend on how you decide to tackle the problem, right? So if you take the work that Amy and Everett are doing on diagnostics, they're trying to build a new method for diagnosing health issues and disease, and for their work to be implemented, you're going to have to retrain doctors, you're going to have to do things differently, and a lot is going to have to change, which will eventually result in a consumer having a better experience. But if you don't have all of those parts in hand beforehand that enable that development, then it's much better just to have some workshops in which you teach more people who aren't necessarily formally trained as doctors to recognize diseases, right? So both of those things will result in people getting more help and their diseases being treated. However, one of them harnesses a much larger amount of technical requirements than the other, and focusing on one might be easier in the short term, but you need a much longer term vision to be able to realize the second one, and you can't necessarily rely on having those resources. And so within a company where you have access to that kind of thing, you might go one way or the other depending on the problem. How would you balance that depending on the problem that you're trying to see at hand?
And Chintan said I can ask a question, so maybe this is I think as you look at such a situation, what would you do? Because your guess is as good as mine.
I'm a graduate student. I know.
And I'm a retired businessman, so I know. No, quite seriously. There are cases where sophistication leads to a better solution, but reaches fewer people. And a homegrown technology or solution looks at a part of what you want to do, but at a prevalent part which leads to serving a larger segment of the population. And someone has to make a judgment. I don't think there is a single answer to that. Probably both can coexist at one time. If one doesn't totally overlap on another, you have one solution for a sophisticated market and another for the vast market that there is, and they can coexist. And I don't think there's a single this or that solution to it.
Great. So I think we have we're very we have let's move on to the final question. We're almost out of time. We are out of time. And that goes to Ana Vargas. She had a bunch of very interesting personal level questions about what skills do you use? What would you do if you go back to school?
So I'm Ana Vargas. I'm from the Housing Group. And we, the architects, admire your architecture career, your previous architecture career, and we were wondering, my question was, which were the most important things you learned?
Sorry?
Which were the most important things that you learned in architecture school? And how have you applied them in your business career?
You had one more that I found very interesting, right? I'm going to add it to it. And if you were to go back to school today, what would you choose to learn?
I mentioned to you that if I had to go back to school today, I probably wouldn't want to do that. It's too much of a strain.
Tata Center.
But in earlier years, first of all, I think you're an architect also, and I found my architectural training very useful in business, which most people won't understand. But contrary to general opinion, it trains you very well to work with human beings and human scale, and to concern yourself with the end user, and then that has been very useful. It's helped me how products come together, pieces come together. But if I look back in time, if I had to go back to school earlier, I would have sought to be a surgeon. And that has faded and gone away. And today I'm just as happy retiring as I am, and I wouldn't want to stress myself in terms of going to college.
All right, so that let me draw this fine discussion to a close. It feels like we could have you here for the whole semester. So before I give you a chance to say final words, thoughts, share your thoughts, let me just say, please come back.
I just like to tell everybody how pleased I am to be here, and how proud I feel that in some small way we have made all of this happen, and that all of you are looking at making a difference in a part of the world that needs the best minds and will to make a difference in a country that I think has tremendous potential. And I hope that all of you can make that difference. What we start in this year will only accelerate and become sort of the gold standard of a very reputed institution using its brain power from its students and researchers to make a difference in a country that has never had this kind of effort made earlier. And I think it's terrific to see so many of you. Last year it was 12 people, and I got a shock when I walked into the room. In ending, I would just like to say, based on that picture, that I am usually known for the guy who accompanies my dog. So next time I hope my dog can be here too.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.